Every single day, you probably open your phone and see a headline screaming something like, "New study proves coffee prevents cancer."
Oh, yeah, constantly.
Right. And you feel great as you pour your morning cup. But then, a week later, the exact same feed hits you with, "Research shows coffee increases cancer risk."
It's the defining whiplash of the modern information age.
Exactly. The science just seems completely broken to us. We read these things, we share them, we panic about them, but we very rarely stop to ask the most fundamental question.
Which is, how do they actually know that?
Yes. Like, what is the architecture of that knowledge? What actually happened in the lab or the field or the database before that headline was ever even written?
We are drowning in data, but we are just utterly starved for context.
And that is exactly our mission for today. Welcome to a deep dive into the hidden blueprint of research itself.
We've got a massive stack of source material today.
Oh, yeah. We're talking textbooks on the philosophy of science, the strict ethical guidelines from the Indian Council of Medical Research, the APA manuals, and these incredibly detailed texts on qualitative research methodologies.
We're going to trace the entire life cycle of a scientific idea, from the deepest, most abstract philosophical worldviews bouncing around a researcher's mind all the way down to the gritty practical details.
Right, like how do they pick the actual people they study? How do they avoid being fooled by bad data?
And how do they navigate massive ethical minefields without, causing harm?
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because long before a researcher can go out and collect a single data point, they have to figure out what they actually believe about reality itself.
Which sounds like an incredibly heavy thought for a Tuesday morning.
It really does. But it's the foundation of everything. Our sources use this fantastic metaphor called the tree of knowledge.
I love that metaphor. The tree of knowledge is just the perfect way to visualize what we call a research paradigm.
A paradigm.
Yeah, a paradigm is fundamentally a worldview. It is the invisible belief system that dictates every single subsequent choice a researcher makes.
Right.
And to truly grasp a paradigm, you really have to look at the entire tree, starting all the way down in the dirt.
Let's start at the roots then.
Yeah?
The sources call this ontology, which is basically asking what is real.
Precisely.
Yeah.
What is the fundamental nature of reality? Because if you ask 5 different researchers, you might get 5 wildly different answers.
Right.
At one extreme of the root system, you have realism. This is the bedrock belief that there is one single objective reality out there in the universe.
And it exists completely independently of whether humans are around to perceive it.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So like a virus is a physical thing. It has a specific genetic code. It replicates in a specific way. And it does its damage whether I personally believe in it or not. The reality of the virus just doesn't care about my feelings.
That is pure realism. But sitting right next to it in the root system is critical realism.
Okay, how is that different?
Well, this worldview takes a step back and offers a bit of humility. It argues that, yes, an objective reality exists, but our human capacity to understand it is profoundly limited.
Oh, because we're flawed.
Right. We are deeply flawed by our own senses and biases.
I think about gravity here. Like gravity is objectively real. It is holding me in this chair right now.
Sure.
But the way Isaac Newton conceptualized gravity mathematically was different from how Albert Einstein conceptualized it curving spacetime.
Exactly.
Which might be totally different from how a quantum physicist understands it today. The actual reality of gravity didn't change, but our human model of it evolved.
That is a brilliant illustration. Our understanding is always just an approximation.
Right.
Now, as we move away from physics and into the social and behavioral sciences, the roots shift dramatically. You encounter relativism.
Relativism.
This is the paradigm-shifting idea that there are actually multiple realities, and they are entirely constructed by human beings.
Wait, multiple realities? That sounds like the plot of a sci-fi multiverse movie, not like a scientific principle.
It does sound esoteric until you apply it to human experience. Think about a concept like happiness or success.
Okay.
To someone working on Wall Street in New York, the reality of success might be intricately tied to financial accumulation, corporate status.
Sure.
But to someone living in a cooperative agricultural village, the reality of success might be defined by ecological balance and family harmony.
Oh, I see.
Relativism argues that you cannot objectively say one is true and the other is false. Both realities are demonstrably true for the people living inside them. They're socially constructed.
That makes perfect sense. The reality isn't out there in the ether. It's built by the culture.
Yeah.
What about idealism and materialism? The sources mentioned those too.
They represent another fascinating split. Idealism posits that reality essentially exists as ideas in the mind.
Like what?
Well, the concept of justice is an idealist reality. You
Right.
cannot put justice in a centrifuge and isolate its molecules.
Right, you can't measure it in a beaker.
Exactly. It exists powerfully, but only because our collective minds conceptualize it. Materialism is the absolute inverse.
Which means?
It dictates that reality is purely physical, tangible, and measurable. To a strict materialist, the feeling of love or grief isn't a mystical experience. It is merely a specific, measurable sequence of electrical impulses and neurochemical releases in the brain.
Okay, those are the roots. Ontology. What is real? So where does the tree grow next?
We move up the trunk. The trunk is epistemology.
Epistemology, which basically translates to, how can we possibly know what is real?
That is the core epistemological puzzle. How do we acquire valid knowledge about whatever reality we just defined? And the trunk has different sides.
Okay, let's break them down.
Objectivism demands that knowledge is an external entity waiting to be independently discovered. The researcher must remain completely detached, neutral, and devoid of influence over the subject.
So objectivism is like the researcher in the sterile white lab coat meticulously measuring the stress levels of a rat in a maze.
Yes, exactly.
They are entirely walled off from the subject. They aren't asking the rat about its childhood. They are measuring cortisol levels in the blood.
That detachment is the hallmark of objectivism. But if you try to apply that sterile lab coat energy to complex human emotions, you often fail to capture the truth.
Right. People aren't rats in a maze.
Exactly. That is where subjectivism steps in. Subjectivism argues that true knowledge arises solely from intimate, individual, personal experiences.
So it's about the internal world.
Yes. If you want to understand the nature of deep grief, measuring heart rates and cortisol won't tell you the whole story. You have to ask people to share their deeply personal narratives.
And sitting somewhere between those two is constructivism, right?
Constructivism is the belief that knowledge isn't just lying around waiting to be found like a gold nugget, and it isn't just locked away inside one isolated person's head.
Where is it?
Knowledge is co-created through social interaction. Meaning is built dynamically together.
Okay, give me an example.
If you walk into a high school classroom, the definition of good behavior in that specific room isn't an objective law of physics. It is a reality co-created by the teacher's rules, the students' pushback, and the culture of the school district.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the last section of the trunk the sources mentioned is pragmatism. This one feels a bit different from the others.
Pragmatism essentially sidesteps the endless philosophical debates about absolute truth.
Oh, so?
The pragmatist looks at the world and says, knowledge is valid if it practically works.
Oh, so it's entirely results-based.
Yes. If a new psychiatric intervention drastically reduces depressive symptoms in patients, the pragmatist says that intervention is true enough to use, regardless of whether it aligns perfectly with idealism or materialism. They are totally focused on utility and outcomes.
So we have the roots of reality, the trunk of how we know it. We're moving further up a tree now, the branches.
The branches represent methodology. This is the actual toolkit. How do we literally conduct the study?
And this is where we find terms most people have actually heard in passing.
Right. Quantitative research, which relies on numbers, massive data sets, and statistical analysis. Qualitative research, which dives into human meaning, lived experiences, and narratives through words and deep observation.
And mixed methods, which pragmatically combines the two.
Exactly. And also participatory research, an incredible approach where the researcher actually partners with the marginalized community they're studying to co-design the entire project together.
There is one final element to this tree metaphor. We have the roots, the trunk, the branches, but the sources highlight the sap running through the entire system.
The lifeblood of the research process, axiology.
Axiology, what values are guiding us? Because science isn't conducted by an algorithm, it's conducted by flawed, emotional humans.
A vital point. Axiology forces researchers to confront their own values. Some strive to be value-free.
Meaning they try to be completely neutral.
Yes. They actively work to suppress their personal politics, biases, and desires to maintain a neutral, objective stance.
I imagine, like, a physicist measuring the speed of light in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Their personal opinion on tax policy has absolutely zero impact on the laser beam. They can realistically be value-free.
But in the social and health sciences, claiming to be value-free is often an illusion. Many paradigms embrace being value-laden.
So they own their biases.
They openly acknowledge their personal values and deliberately let them shape the research agenda. A prominent example is feminist research.
Right.
It explicitly centers women's lived experiences and values the aggressive uncovering of historical patriarchal biases in science. The axiology is built around empowerment.
That makes a lot of sense.
And universally, across all modern research, there is an expectation of ethical reflexivity.
Ethical reflexivity meaning constantly interrogating yourself.
Yes, the researcher must relentlessly reflect on their own inherent biases, their power dynamics, and how their physical and cultural presence might be actively altering the community they are studying.
So when you zoom out and look at this entire tree, the roots of reality, the trunk of knowledge, the branches of methodology, and the sap of values, what do you actually get?
You get the major paradigms. These are the massive, overarching worldviews that dominate the scientific landscape. And the oldest and most classical is positivism.
Positivism feels like what we were all taught in middle school science class.
It absolutely is. Positivism sits firmly on the roots of realism. There is one objective reality. Its trunk is objectivism. We discover it through detached observation.
And its branches.
Almost entirely quantitative. Experiments, surveys, hard numbers. And its sap is value-free. The ultimate goal of positivism is to find universal laws that can predict human behavior the way physics predicts the trajectory of a cannonball.
But the sources quickly pivot to post-positivism, which honestly feels like positivism after a serious reality check.
A very necessary reality check. Post-positivism embraces critical realism. It concedes that while an objective reality exists, human beings are simply too flawed to measure it perfectly.
Right. Our tools have margins of error.
Exactly. Our minds have unconscious biases. So a post-positivist will never say they have proven an absolute truth. They will say they are reasonably certain based on the current probability.
So they still love quantitative data, but they analyze it with a deep sense of humility.
Spot on.
Let's shift gears completely to the constructivist or interpretivist paradigm, because this worldview operates on a totally different frequency.
Oh, completely.
Their roots are relativism, multiple constructed realities. Their trunk is apposite. Subjectivism knowledge is co-created. And their branches are qualitative.
Yes. They rely on deep interviews, ethnographies, and personal stories. They are not looking for universal laws. A constructivist doesn't care about predicting the behavior of the average human.
What do they care about then?
They want to understand the profound, highly contextual meaning of a specific phenomenon for a specific, unique group of people.
Okay, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener who might be feeling a bit skeptical.
Go for it.
If a constructivist doesn't believe in a single, objective, tangible reality, and they think all knowledge is just a social agreement, how on earth is that considered science?
It's a fair question.
Doesn't that risk validating complete nonsense? Like, if a community collectively decides that the sky is actually neon green and that is their constructed reality, is a constructivist researcher just going to write a paper confirming the sky is green?
It is the most common and vital critique of this paradigm, but it stems from a misunderstanding of what the researcher is actually measuring.
Okay, unpack that.
The constructivist is not acting as a meteorologist. They are not trying to measure the physics of atmospheric light scattering. They are acting as a social scientist studying the human experience.
So they don't actually care about the physical sky.
They care about the human consequence of the belief. If an isolated community genuinely believes the sky is neon green, and that deeply held belief dictates their agricultural planting cycles, forms the basis of the religious worship, and creates a social hierarchy where only those who see the green sky can hold political power,
Wow, okay.
then that belief is the absolute functional reality of their social world.
The belief has physical, real-world consequences, even if the premise is scientifically false.
Exactly. The scientific rigor comes from how meticulously the researcher maps that constructed reality. They don't just chat with one person and publish a paper.
What do they do?
They spend months or years engaged in deep participant observation, cross-referencing dozens of interviews, analyzing historical texts, and tracking the power dynamics to prove exactly how that green sky reality is constructed, enforced, and maintained by the society.
That's fascinating. It's an incredibly rigorous investigation of human meaning-making.
It's the science of meaning, not the science of molecules.
I love that. We also have the critical theory and feminist paradigms listed.
Right. These paradigms inject a powerful, necessary lens of power, struggle, and inequality. They view reality as something heavily shaped and often distorted by historical, economic, and patriarchal forces.
So their axiology is unapologetically value-laden.
Very much so. They do not just want to passively observe a marginalized community, they want to empower that community to dismantle oppressive structures.
And finally, rounding out the paradigms, we have the pragmatists.
The ultimate problem solvers. Pragmatists refuse to swear blind loyalty to a single philosophical root. They look at the specific problem facing them and ask, what is the most effective tool in the toolbox?
So they're the great champions of mixed methods.
Exactly. If they need hard numbers to prove a social trend exists, they will deploy a massive quantitative survey. If they then need to understand the painful human stories driving that trend, they will sit down and do qualitative interviews. They do whatever works to create actionable change.
Okay, so a researcher has done the soul searching. They know their paradigm,
Yeah.
but they can't just walk out the front door and start randomly taking notes. They need an architectural framework to organize their ideas.
Right.
And this brings us to the concept of theory.
Theory is the scaffolding of science. The American Psychological Association formally defines a theory as a coherent set of propositions that explains phenomena by specifying relationships among variables.
That is a very dense textbook definition, specifying relationships among variable.
It is a bit dry.
Let's bring that down to earth.
Mm-hmm.
How does a theory actually function in the real world?
The sources provide a deeply human and compelling case study to illustrate this. The life of Princess Diana.
The Princess of Wales, which is a fascinating choice for a scientific case study.
If you examine Princess Diana's life as merely a chronological list of events, it appears chaotic, contradictory, and deeply tragic.
You see immense global adulation sitting right next to profound personal isolation.
Exactly. But psychologists can apply a specific theoretical lens, John Bowlby's attachment theory, to instantly organize that chaos into a deeply understandable pattern.
Let's lay the groundwork for that. Bowlby's attachment theory basically argues that our earliest foundational relationships with our primary caregivers create a psychological blueprint.
Right. If we feel safe, seen, and secure as infants, we use that blueprint to build healthy, secure relationships as adults.
And if those early bonds are disrupted, we develop insecure attachment patterns. Diana's childhood was notoriously difficult. Her parents went through a bitter public separation when she was incredibly young.
There was a profound lack of consistent emotional availability. According to the framework of attachment theory, this environment severely disrupted her foundational sense of safety.
Leading to what psychologists categorize as an insecure, anxious attachment style.
Yes.
So the theory organizes the past. But how does it explain her adult life? Because she wasn't just struggling, she was arguably the most empathetic public figure of the 20th century.
That is the predictive power of a robust theory. Attachment theory doesn't just say, you had a hard childhood, so you will be sad. It specifies complex psychological pathways.
Yeah.
It predicts that individuals with certain types of insecure attachments often develop a heightened, almost radar-like sensitivity to the emotional pain of others. Because they lacked a protector, they become fiercely attuned to vulnerability.
Which perfectly explains the seeming contradiction of her public lives. The establishment royals couldn't understand why she would walk into a hospital, take off her gloves, and physically hold the hands of AIDS patients at the height of the 1980s panic.
Exactly, or why she would walk through active landmine fields in Angola. Her own internal pain created a bridge of radical empathy to the marginalized and the suffering.
The theory takes the disparate, confusing variables of her life, her private struggles with intimacy, and her public displays of profound compassion, and specifies the psychological relationship between them. It turns chaos into a comprehensible human narrative.
But the sources also state that theory isn't just a retroactive explanation tool. It must guide new research.
So how did Diana's life guide the scientific community forward?
It happened because of her unprecedented public vulnerability, specifically regarding her battle with bulimia.
Right.
Prior to her speaking out, eating disorders were heavily stigmatized and often viewed through a very narrow behavioral lens. But her openness prompted researchers to apply Bowlby's theory to a new domain.
So they generated a completely new testable hypothesis.
Yes. They asked, does insecure early attachment significantly increase psychological vulnerability to the development of eating disorders in adulthood?
They took the existing theory, applied it to the reality she exposed, and built a brand new scientific question.
And that leads us to the absolute non-negotiable characteristic of any valid scientific theory:
Falsifiability.
Falsifiability, championed by the philosopher of science, Karl Popper. Popper introduced a radical idea. He argued that for any theory to be considered genuinely scientific, it must be logically structured in a way that allows it in principle to be proven wrong by empirical evidence.
A theory must make bold, risky predictions that can fail.
Ex-
You know, the word falsifiability sounds inherently negative to people outside the sciences. It sounds like the entire goal of a scientist is to just run around calling everyone a liar.
It really does.
But let me try an analogy to explain why it's actually the greatest strength of science.
Go for it.
Imagine you are engineering a massive suspension bridge. You don't test the safety of that bridge by proving it can stand up to a gentle spring breeze. That proves nothing.
Right.
You test the bridge by driving heavier and heavier concrete trucks over it, stressing the cables, actively trying to figure out exactly how much weight it takes to snap the steel. Science is the process of trying to break its own ideas.
That is a phenomenal analogy. If an engineer designs a bridge that they claim can hold infinite weight, but refuses to let anyone drive a truck over it to test that claim, it is useless as a structural model.
Exactly.
In psychology, if a theory is so incredibly vague and slippery that it can be twisted to explain absolutely any human behavior, if it accommodates every possible outcome, then it actually predicts nothing.
If my psychological theory says, tomorrow, you will either feel an emotion or you won't, that theory is completely unfalsifiable. Because no matter what you do, the theory gets to claim it was right.
Precisely. Historically, Popper used this to criticize certain interpretations of Freudian psychoanalysis.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If a man pushed a child into a river, the theory could say it was the result of severe unconscious repression. If another man dove into the river and sacrificed his life to save the child, the same theory could claim it was a psychological mechanism of sublimation.
So it explains everything, which means it explains nothing.
Exactly. If the theory perfectly explains both murder and martyrdom using the exact same premise, it is untestable. It is pseudoscience.
A true scientific hypothesis has to stick its neck out. It must state, under condition X, specific behavior Y will occur.
Yes, and if the researchers set up the experiment and behavior Y fails to occur, the theory must take the damage. The bridge cracks.
The researchers must then revise the theory, narrow its scope, or throw it out entirely. The wreckage of failed theories is the foundation of scientific progress.
Which perfectly ties into the other hallmarks of a good theory listed in the sources. A theory must possess clarity and precision. The concepts cannot be muddy.
It must have internal consistency. The propositions cannot mathematically or logically contradict one another.
It requires empirical validity. It has to be supported by actual, rigorous, real-world data.
It needs generality.
Yeah.
It should apply across a broad range of situations, not just one highly specific moment in time.
And finally, it requires parsimony.
Parsimony,
Yeah.
meaning extreme simplicity and economy of explanation.
It is often referred to as Occam's razor. If you are presented with two competing theories that explain the exact same phenomenon equally well, you are scientifically obligated to choose the simpler one.
Right. If theory A requires 12 complex interlocking assumptions to work, and theory B explains the exact same outcome using only two simple assumptions, theory B wins.
Unnecessary complexity is the enemy of good science.
Before we move off theory, we have to touch on the distinction our sources make between pure research and applied research.
It is the difference between building the engine and driving the car. Pure research, often called basic research, is deeply foundational. Its sole goal is to generate knowledge, explain phenomena, and refine the theory itself.
So John Bowlby's spending decades intensely observing the subtle interactions between mothers and infants to map the biological mechanisms of attachment. That is pure research. He's building the theoretical engine.
Exactly. Applied research takes that engine and puts it on the road. It aims to solve immediate, practical, real-world problems.
So what does that look like?
Applied research takes Bowlby's pure theory of attachment and uses it to design a targeted clinical intervention program for teenagers suffering from severe emotional dysregulation.
Pure research asks, how does this work? Applied research asks, how can we use this to help people right now?
And they are trapped in a beautiful, endless cycle. Pure theory informs clinical practice, and the messy realities of clinical practice highlight the flaws in the pure theory, forcing it to evolve.
Okay, let's take stock. Our researcher has a paradigm. They have a sturdy, parsimonious, falsifiable theory. Now, the theoretical phase ends. They have to actually go out into the messy, chaotic world and gather data. They have to choose their methodological path.
We return to the branches of the tree of knowledge. And the choice between quantitative and qualitative research isn't just about whether you prefer doing algebra or reading poetry.
Right.
It is a profound philosophical choice about what kind of reality you are trying to capture.
Let's quickly review the quantitative path before we dive deep into the qualitative, because our sources dedicate a massive amount of focus to the latter.
Good idea.
Quantitative research is firmly rooted in the post-positivist paradigm. It views reality as something that can be observed, categorized, and mathematically measured. It relies heavily on deductive reasoning.
Deductive reasoning is the classic top-down approach. You begin with a broad established theory. You deduce a highly specific testable hypothesis from that theory. Then you collect hard numerical data to definitively prove or disprove that hypothesis.
The progression is always theory, then hypothesis, then data. And they gather this data using highly standardized instruments to ensure complete objectivity.
Yes, they utilize experimental designs where you carefully manipulate a variable, like giving half a group a new drug and half a placebo, to establish strict cause and effect.
Or they use correlational designs to mathematically prove that as variable A goes up, variable B predictably goes down.
The entire apparatus is built on precise measurement, statistical significance, and maintaining an impenetrable wall of neutrality between the researcher and the subjects.
Which works beautifully for testing drug efficacy or mapping economic trends. But here is where it gets incredibly interesting. I want to spend significant time unpacking qualitative research, because our sources provide a masterclass on its history, its significance, and the intricate designs it uses.
It's a huge shift. Qualitative research completely flips the script. It is anchored in the constructivist paradigm. It rejects the idea that human reality can be reduced to a spreadsheet.
To understand its significance, the sources say you have to look at the historical background of qualitative inquiry in psychology.
Right. By the mid-20th century, psychology was heavily dominated by strict behaviorism and positivist experimental models. The prevailing scientific attitude was essentially, if you cannot measure it in a lab with a stopwatch or a survey scale, it does not exist and it is not science.
That is a brutally reductive view of the human experience.
Exactly, and a massive counter-movement emerged. Pioneers in qualitative inquiry argued that this obsession with quantification was stripping the humanity out of the human sciences.
They argued that trying to understand complex trauma or cultural identity or the nuance of human resilience by asking people to circle a number between 1 and 5 was intellectually bankrupt.
So they completely reversed the engine. Instead of deductive reasoning, qualitative research uses inductive reasoning.
Inductive reasoning is bottom-up.
You do not start with a rigid theory and force the world to fit into it. You start in the dirt. You start with open-ended exploration, gathering rich, unstructured data, hours of interviews, pages of field notes, personal diaries.
You immerse yourself in the chaotic reality of the participants.
And you allow the patterns, themes, and eventually the theory to slowly emerge organically from the data itself. The researcher is no longer a detached observer behind glass. They are an active, empathetic instrument of data collection.
The sources outline several distinct, incredibly rigorous methodologies under the qualitative umbrella. Let's walk through them in detail, starting with phenomenology.
A fascinating approach.
What exactly does it mean to study a lived experience?
Phenomenology is a profoundly philosophical approach. Its core objective is to isolate and describe the fundamental essence of a specific phenomenon as it is consciously experienced by the people living through it.
It doesn't care about statistics.
Not at all. It asks, what is the texture, the feeling, the internal architecture of this experience?
Give me a concrete scenario. How would a phenomenologist study something like surviving a massive natural disaster compared to a quantitative researcher?
If a devastating earthquake hits a city, a quantitative researcher might deploy a standardized survey to 5,000 survivors, asking them to rate their current level of post-traumatic stress on a Likert scale.
And the result is just a number. Like average PTSD score is 7.4.
Exactly. A phenomenological researcher, however, will sit down in a quiet room with perhaps 6 individual survivors. They will ask open-ended, probing questions.
Like what?
Walk me through the exact moment the ground began to shift. What happened to your perception of time? How did your relationship with the physical walls of your home change in the weeks after? What does safety feel like in your body now?
They're trying to capture the emotional DNA of the event.
Yes. They analyze the transcripts line by line to find the universal underlying structures of the earthquake survivor's experience.
And our sources differentiate between 2 main approaches here, right?
Yes. The transcendental approach. championed by Husserl, demands that the researcher rigorously bracket out or set aside their own preconceptions to see the experience purely.
And the other one?
The hermeneutical approach, influenced by Heidegger, argues that such pure detachment is completely impossible, and that the researcher's active interpretation of the text is an inescapable, vital part of uncovering the meaning.
That leads us to the second qualitative design, which honestly blew my mind. Grounded theory.
It's a game changer.
We just spent a long time talking about how crucial a theory is, but grounded theory demands that you research something without a theory. That sounds paradoxical.
It is a radical departure. It was developed in the 1960s by sociologists Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss. Grounded theory isn't about testing an existing theory. Its entire purpose is the aggressive generation of a brand new theory.
And to do that authentically, you must deliberately enter the field setting without a preconceived theoretical framework clouding your vision. So if you are studying, say, the coping mechanisms of nurses in a high mortality ward, you don't read the existing literature on coping first.
Glaser actually argued that you should avoid doing a deep literature review beforehand, precisely so you don't accidentally force your new data into old established boxes.
You just enter the ward and you just start observing and interviewing.
And this triggers a grueling, highly systematic process. First is theoretical sampling. You collect a little data, analyze it, and let that analysis dictate who you interview next to test your emerging ideas. You're constantly pivoting.
And how do they actually analyze hours and hours of nurses talking?
Through a rigorous process called coding. You take the raw interview transcript and break it down line by line, assigning action-oriented labels to every single sentence. This is open coding.
Okay, open coding. What's next?
Then you use axial coding to find the connections between those labels. Finally, selective coding identifies the core overarching narrative.
And driving this entire process is the engine of constant comparison.
The researcher is relentlessly bouncing back and forth. They compare one nurse's interview against another nurse's interview. They compare the new interviews against the emerging codes. They compare the codes against the developing categories.
You do this exhaustively until they reach what the sources call theoretical saturation.
Meaning, new interviews are no longer providing any new insights. Out of this massive, exhausting comparative labor, a new theory organically grows out of the ground.
It sounds incredibly labor-intensive.
It is arguably one of the most intellectually demanding methodologies in the social sciences.
Let's move to the third qualitative design, ethnography, which has deep roots in cultural anthropology.
While phenomenology focuses on an individual's internal experience, ethnography zooms out to study the shared culture of an entire group. The researcher physically and socially embeds themselves within a specific cultural setting for an extended period, often months or years.
Their goal is to crack the code of the group's shared behaviors, unspoken rules, rituals, and language.
So instead of inviting teenagers into a sterile university lab to ask them about their smartphone habits, an ethnographer basically goes and lives in the high school cafeteria.
Exactly. They enter the natural habitat. And doing this successfully is incredibly fraught. The sources emphasize the massive challenge of accessing field settings. You cannot just wander into a close-knit community.
You have to identify and negotiate with gatekeepers.
The informal leaders who hold the social keys to the group. You have to slowly, painstakingly build trust so the community stops performing for you and starts acting naturally.
I imagine the documentation process is overwhelming.
It relies heavily on meticulous, exhausting field notes. The ethnographer must write down everything they see, hear, smell, and feel, constantly separating objective observations from their own subjective interpretations.
And the sources distinguish between realist ethnography, which attempts to provide a traditional, objective, third-person account of the culture, and critical ethnography.
What does a critical ethnographer do?
A critical ethnographer explicitly focuses on mapping the hidden power dynamics, the systemic inequalities, and the marginalized voices within that culture, often with the intent of advocating for social change. They are highly aware of the psychological toll of the work.
Including the danger of going native.
Yes, becoming so embedded in the culture that they lose their analytical distance entirely.
The fourth qualitative design is narrative inquiry.
Humans are fundamentally storytelling animals. Narrative inquiry capitalizes on this by focusing entirely on the stories individuals tell to make sense of their own lives.
It assumes that we construct our very identities through narrative.
The researcher doesn't just look at what the person says, they rigorously analyze the narrative structures. How does the participant frame the beginning, middle, and end? Who are the villains and heroes in their personal mythology?
What are the critical turning points or epiphanies they highlight? By analyzing the architecture of the story, the researcher uncovers how the individual navigates trauma, illness, or identity shifts.
It's deeply personal.
We also have case studies listed.
A case study is an exhaustive 360-degree deep dive into a single, bounded entity. That case could be a single extraordinary individual, a specific historical event, a unique classroom, or an entire corporation.
The researcher triangulates massive amounts of data interviews, archival documents, direct observations, physical artifacts to understand that specific case in its real-life context.
They can be single case studies for unique phenomena, or multiple case studies to compare and contrast different contexts.
Finally, the special qualitative focus brings up Participative Action Research, or PAR.
PAR is a radical democratization of science. Traditionally, research is done on a community by an outside expert. In PAR, the research is done with the community.
The marginalized group being studied is invited to act as co-researchers.
They help define the research question, they assist in gathering the data, and they help analyze the results. The ultimate goal isn't just to publish a paper, it is to generate direct, actionable social change for that community.
That sounds beautiful in theory, but the power dynamics must be a total nightmare to navigate.
The challenges are immense. Academic researchers often struggle to surrender their perceived authority. Community members may have conflicting agendas. Balancing the strict requirements of academic rigor with the immediate, messy, practical needs of the community requires constant, delicate negotiation.
Okay, I have to step in with the classic positivist pushback here.
I was waiting for this.
I hear all of this, the phenomenology, the deep ethnography. It is beautiful, rich work. But if a qualitative researcher spends a year and only interviews 10 people for a phenomenological study, how on earth is that scientifically trustworthy?
Right.
How can you possibly generalize the findings of 10 people to the rest of the human race compared to a quantitative survey that captures 10,000 data points?
It is the most frequent attack leveled at qualitative research, but it fundamentally misunderstands the objective. Quantitative research aims for statistical generalizability. It wants to know if the numbers apply broadly.
Okay, and qualitative?
Qualitative research does not care about statistical averages. It aims for deep contextual understanding and transferability. It argues that by understanding the deep mechanics of one specific human experience, you uncover insights that can be thoughtfully transferred to understand similar contexts.
But how do we know the researcher isn't just hallucinating patterns or cherry-picking quotes that fit their personal bias?
Because qualitative researchers utilize strict, rigorous protocols to establish trustworthiness, which is their equivalent of statistical validity.
What kind of protocols?
First, they use triangulation. They never rely on a single source of evidence. If an ethnographic interview reveals a specific cultural anxiety, the researcher cross-references that by looking for evidence of that anxiety in their observational field notes and then checks historical community documents.
If all 3 points of the triangle converge on the same conclusion, the finding is robust.
It's like a journalistic standard of requiring multiple independent sources.
What's next?
Second, they use member checking. This is a profound display of accountability. The researcher takes their final written analysis back to the actual participants and asks, did I capture your reality accurately? Did I misinterpret your story?
Oh, wow.
The participants have the power to correct the record.
And finally, reflexivity.
Yeah.
Qualitative researchers write themselves into the methodology. They must explicitly document their own biases, their background, and how their presence in the room inevitably shaped the conversation.
It is a transparency of process that quantitative research often lacks.
Which perfectly sets up mixed methods. Because why fight over numbers versus stories when you can use pragmatism to smash them together?
Exactly. Mixed methods leverages the strengths of both branches to offset their individual weaknesses. You can use a convergent design, where you deploy a massive quantitative survey and conduct deep qualitative interviews simultaneously.
And then merge the results to see if the numbers match the narratives.
Or you use what the sources call explanatory sequential.
Yes. You run the quantitative phase first to discover the broad what. You survey 5,000 college students and find out a statistically significant 30% are experiencing severe burnout. That's the what.
Then, sequentially, you launch the qualitative phase. You select 20 of those burned out students and conduct phenomenological interviews to understand the deep, structural why behind the numbers.
And the exploratory sequential design just flips the order. You do the open-ended qualitative exploration first because you don't even know what questions to ask yet.
Once you discover the themes through interviews, you use those themes to custom build a quantitative survey to test on a larger population.
It is the ultimate pragmatic approach. You build a complete multidimensional understanding of the problem.
Okay, so we have mapped the theoretical and methodological universe, but now we face a crushing logistical reality. Let's say we decide to study anxiety in American college students. There are millions of them.
We do not have the time, the funding, or the sanity to interview or survey all of them. We have to select a tiny fraction to represent the whole.
This brings us to the dark art of sampling, and how a researcher selects their subjects can completely validate or utterly destroy the entire study.
Sampling is the silent killer of bad science. If your sample's flawed, every single subsequent statistical calculation, no matter how complex, is structurally compromised.
The sampling universe is divided into two distinct kingdoms:
Mm-hmm.
probability sampling and non-probability sampling.
Let's start with the gold standard. Probability sampling. The core definition here is that every single person in the target population has a known equal chance of being selected, right?
Yes. That equal probability is the mathematical armor that protects the study from selection bias. It ensures the sample is a true miniature mirror of the larger population. The most foundational technique is simple random sampling.
It's the lottery system. If a small town has 10,000 registered voters, you get a spreadsheet with all 10,000 names, assign a number to each, and hit a random number generator to select 1,000 people.
Conceptually, it is perfect. Practically, it is often a nightmare. Simple random sampling only works if your population is relatively small, highly homogeneous, and crucially, if you possess an accurate, exhaustive master list of every single individual.
In real-world social science, getting a complete list of any large population is nearly impossible.
Furthermore, pure randomness can create statistical anomalies. Imagine you were studying a high school with 1,000 students. You need a sample of 100. You use a random number generator.
Okay.
By pure mathematical chance, the generator selects 85 freshmen, 10 sophomores, and only 5 seniors. Your resulting data on high school attitudes is going to be wildly, catastrophically skewed toward the perspective of 14-year-olds.
The randomness actually destroyed the representation, so how do researchers fix that?
They use stratified sampling. They proactively identify the key demographic characteristics called strata that must be proportionally represented. In the high school example, the strata are the grade levels.
You physically divide the population list into 4 separate buckets: 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades.
Only then do you perform a simple random draw within each individual bucket, pulling exactly 25 names from each. You force the randomness to be proportionally balanced.
That is incredibly elegant. But what happens when the logistical scale is just too massive? Say a researcher wants to study childhood obesity rates across hundreds of rural villages spread out over an entire massive state like Texas or Maharashtra. You can't possibly stratify millions of people you don't have a list of.
That geographical nightmare requires cluster sampling. Instead of trying to sample individual people, you sample entire geographic boundaries. The villages themselves become the clusters.
You obtain a map containing all 5,000 villages in the state. You randomly select, say, 50 of those villages.
Then the research team physically travels to only those 50 selected clusters and systematically surveys every single eligible household within those specific boundaries. It radically reduces travel time and costs while maintaining the integrity of probability sampling at the cluster level.
The final probability method mentioned is systematic sampling.
This is a brilliant workaround for dynamic environments where you can't build a list in advance. Imagine you need to survey morning commuters at a massive, chaotic subway station.
Okay.
You decide to approach every nth person. You randomly pick a starting number between 1 and 10, say 4. You stand at the turnstile, let 3 people pass, and survey the 4th person. Then the 14th, the 24th, the 34th.
It achieves quasi-randomization in a constantly moving flow of humanity.
Okay, probability sampling makes total mathematical sense. But what happens when the math is impossible? When you are dealing with situations where you cannot randomize?
We enter the kingdom of non-probability sampling. And I want to go immediately to the most controversial one, convenience sampling.
I knew you would.
The definition is essentially grabbing the participants who are easiest to reach. I have a major bone to pick with this. If I want to write a scientific paper on the political attitudes of the American public, And I just walked down the hall and surveyed the 12 people sitting in my immediate office break room because it's highly convenient for me. How is that not just scientific fraud?
It is entirely skewed.
It is inherently massively biased by my geography, my industry, and my social circle.
You are absolutely correct to be furious at that concept.
Mhm.
Historically, convenience sampling has led to spectacular scientific humiliations. The most famous example is the 1936 Literary Digest presidential poll.
Oh, this is a great story.
The magazine wanted to predict the election between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Alf Landon. They mailed out 10 million mock ballots. They received over 2 million back, a massive sample size. They confidently predicted a landslide victory for Landon.
A few weeks later, FDR won one of the most crushing, overwhelming landslide victories in American history. The magazine was utterly humiliated and soon went bankrupt.
How did 2 million data points get it so spectacularly wrong?
Because of how they built their mailing list. They generated their list of names using telephone directories and automobile registration records in the middle of the Great Depression.
So they inadvertently created a massive convenience sample, composed almost entirely of wealthy individuals who could afford phones and cars in 1936.
A demographic that heavily skewed Republican. They completely ignored the massive working class base that propelled FDR to victory.
A sample of 2 million biased data points is infinitely worse than a sample of 2,000 randomized ones.
So if convenience sampling is that dangerous, why does the scientific community allow it to exist?
Because it serves a highly specific, restricted purpose.
The pilot study.
The pilot study. Imagine you spend a year designing a complex new psychological questionnaire to measure a subtle new form of workplace burnout. Before you spend $1 million deploying it to a stratified national sample, you need to know if the physical instrument actually functions.
Are the questions confusing? Does it take an hour to complete? Did the digital form crash?
To test the mechanics of the study, convenience sampling your office mates or a lecture hall of undergraduates is cheap, fast, and completely valid. You just cannot extrapolate their answers to the general population.
Okay, the pilot study exception makes sense. What about purposive sampling?
This is highly intentional and deeply tied to qualitative research. The researcher actively uses their expert judgment to handpick individuals who possess highly specific, unique characteristics.
If you were conducting a phenomenological study on the psychological coping mechanisms of elite Olympic gymnasts who have suffered career-ending spine injuries, you do not want a random sample. A random sample is useless.
You deliberately hunt down those exact 5 individuals who meet your intense criteria.
And what if those individuals are actively hiding? The next method is snowball sampling.
Snowball sampling is the only way to penetrate hidden, highly marginalized, or legally vulnerable populations. Think about attempting to study the lived experiences of undocumented immigrants, or individuals entrenched in illicit drug networks.
Or whistleblowers within a corrupt corporation. There is no master list. If an academic researcher walks into these communities with a clipboard, they will be met with absolute silence and deep suspicion.
Right. The power dynamics make direct recruitment impossible. So the researcher works tirelessly to build deep trust with just 1 or 2 initial participants. They conduct the interviews. At the end, they ask the critical question.
Do you know anyone else in your network who might be willing to speak with me? Can you vouch for me?
The participant reaches out to their friend, assures them the researcher is safe, and the network slowly opens up. The sample grows organically through referral, like a snowball rolling down a mountain, accumulating mass.
It leverages the community's internal trust networks to overcome the barrier of fear.
That is incredibly resourceful. The final non-probability method is quota sampling.
Quota sampling is the non-random cousin of stratified sampling. You know you need your sample to reflect certain demographics, say 50% male, 50% female.
But instead of randomly drawing from lists, you just stand in a mall and use convenience methods to interview people until you hit exactly 50 men and 50 women, and then you stop.
It is heavily utilized in fast-paced market research and political polling, where extreme speed and tight budgets are prioritized over perfect statistical rigor.
Okay. The theoretical foundation is laid. The methodological design is locked. We know exactly who and how we are sampling. The researcher is finally ready to begin, right?
Not even close. Because before a researcher can ethically ask for a single dollar of grant funding or approach a single human participant, they must aggressively prove that their brilliant, groundbreaking idea hasn't already been thoroughly answered by someone else 10 years ago.
Which transitions us to the vast, intimidating ocean of existing scientific literature. The researcher has to stand on the shoulders of giants, which means they first have to find the giants.
And as anyone who has fallen down an academic rabbit hole at 3 a.m. knows, navigating scientific databases is a highly technical skill.
It is not a Google search. The volume of published science is staggering. Advanced literature searching requires mastering indexing and abstracting databases and learning how to communicate in their specific, rigid language.
Let's decode that language. The sources highlight Boolean operators.
Boolean operators are the mathematical logic gates of database searching. Any or R, not T. They are incredibly powerful if used correctly.
If you type diabetes Andy exercise into a database, the ANDI operator demands intersection. The database will aggressively filter out millions of papers, returning only the specific studies that contain both of those exact concepts. It drastically narrows your search.
Conversely, OR acts as a massive net. If I search adolescents or teenagers, I am telling the database to capture papers that use either term. Because a psychologist in London might write adolescent, while a sociologist in Chicago writes teenager, and I need both papers.
Exactly. It broadens the scope by capturing synonyms. And then there's the surgical precision of the not operator. If you are researching unipolar depression, a basic search for depression will overwhelm you with thousands of papers on bipolar disorder.
By searching depression not bipolar, you command the database to instantly vaporize any paper that mentions the word bipolar, leaving you with a highly refined dataset.
The sources also talk about controlled vocabulary. What does that mean in practice?
It solves the chaos of human language. Imagine you are researching heart attacks. One brilliant paper titles itself A Study on Heart Attacks. A second brilliant paper calls it myocardial infarction. A third calls it acute cardiac arrest.
If you only search the words heart attack, the database's algorithm will completely miss the other two vital papers.
To fix this, elite medical databases like PubMed employ human indexers behind the scenes. They read every single paper and tag them with standardized labels from a controlled list. In medicine, the system is called MASH, medical subject headings.
The indexer reads all three of those papers and assigns them all the exact same MASH tag, myocardial infarction.
So when a researcher searches that specific MASH term, they instantly capture every single relevant paper, regardless of the creative vocabulary the author decided to use in the title.
Okay, so through Boolean magic and MASH tags, I've downloaded 500 papers. But the internet is a landfill of bad information. How do I quickly filter out the garbage?
The sources provide a highly memorable, highly effective filtering metric known as the CRAA test, CRAAP.
I deeply appreciate academic acronyms with a sense of humor. Let's run a hypothetical piece of fake news through it to see how it works. Say I find an article claiming healing crystals proven to cure baldness. Let's test it.
First is C for currency. When was this published? If the article cites a revolutionary study from 1994 and no one has mentioned it in the 30 years since, the science is likely dead.
R is for relevance. Does this article actually address the biological mechanism of hair follicle regeneration, or is it just a broad philosophical essay about crystal energy?
A is for authority. This is critical. Who wrote it? Is the author a board-certified dermatologist with a PhD in cellular biology, or is it a lifestyle blogger who runs a crystal shop online?
And the second A is accuracy. Where is the actual data? Are there peer-reviewed citations? Was it tested in a lab? Or are the only sources anecdotal quotes from anonymous customers?
Finally, P for purpose. Why does this information exist? Is the purpose to objectively advance dermatological science, or is there a massive Buy Now button at the bottom of the page? The CRAA test forces you to interrogate the underlying motivations of the information.
Speaking of finding this information, the sources present a showdown between the major academic databases: Scopus, Web of Science, and Google Scholar. I'm going to act as the proxy for every broke college student right now. Google Scholar is completely free. It is blisteringly fast. It finds everything from PDFs to obscure books.
Right.
Why on earth do university library systems pay exorbitant, multi-million-dollar subscription fees to access Web of Science or Scopus?
It is the difference between shopping at a massive, unregulated flea market versus a highly curated, secure vault. Google Scholar's greatest strength, its massive inclusion, is also its greatest fatal flaw for rigorous academic research.
How so?
Google Scholar's indexing algorithm is highly opaque. It scrapes the entire web, meaning it pulls in vast amounts of unverified, non-peer-reviewed content, student essays, and predatory journal articles. It completely lacks the controlled vocabulary we just discussed, making precision searching impossible.
And its citation tracking is notoriously messy, often artificially inflating the citation counts of papers by counting duplicate uploads.
It provides quantity, but completely abandons quality control. Web of Science, conversely, is one of the oldest and most ruthless databases in existence. It is highly curated. Only the absolute highest tier, rigorously peer-reviewed academic journals are allowed inside its walls.
When you search Web of Science, you know every result has survived a brutal vetting process.
Furthermore, premium databases like Web of Science and Scopus provide an incredibly powerful tool called citation chaining.
Tracing the lineage of an idea.
Yes. If you find one brilliant foundational paper published in 2012, Web of Science allows you to click a button and instantly view every single subsequent paper published over the last 14 years that has cited that 2012 study in their bibliography.
It allows a researcher to literally watch an idea evolve forward through time, tracking who challenged it, who expanded it, and who proved it wrong. You are paying the subscription fee for absolute precision, guaranteed quality, and temporal mapping tools.
Okay, the researcher has curated a flawless pile of 100 high-quality papers. Now they have to synthesize them into a literature review. And the sources detail several different architectures for doing this.
The traditional format is the narrative review. This is essentially the author telling a broad qualitative story about the history and current state of a topic. But the sources note this is highly susceptible to selection bias.
The author can consciously or unconsciously cherry-pick only the studies that happen to agree with their personal theory, creating a deeply skewed narrative.
To combat that bias, researchers developed the scoping review. Scoping review doesn't try to answer one highly specific question. Its goal is to map the entire existing landscape of evidence on a broad topic. It operates on a rigorous 5-stage framework developed by Arksey and O'Malley.
The researcher must explicitly state their broad question, systematically search the databases using defined Boolean strings, rigorously select the studies based on predefined inclusion criteria, meticulously chart out all the data, and then collate and report the results. It is a massive, transparent mapping exercise.
But the absolute pinnacle of the evidence hierarchy, the undisputed gold standard of scientific synthesis, is the systematic review and meta-analysis.
It is the ultimate heavy artillery of science. A systematic review does not ask a broad question. It asks a razor-sharp clinical question. For example, does a 50 milligram daily dose of medication X reduce severe migraine frequency in women over 40 compared to a placebo?
The goal of the systematic review is to hunt down and analyze every single piece of evidence ever generated in the history of humanity regarding that specific question. And to prove they didn't cherry-pick, they must use a tool called the Prisma flow diagram.
I have seen these diagrams in medical papers. They are literal visual flowcharts detailing a brutal funnel of elimination.
Brutal is the right word. The top box of the diagram might say, database searches identified 14,320 potential records. The next box removed 4,000 duplicate records.
Then screened 10,000 titles and abstracts, eliminated 9,500 for irrelevance. It forces the researcher to visually account for the death of every single paper.
Finally, at the very bottom of the funnel, the final box might read, 22 rigorously peer-reviewed randomized controlled trials met the strict criteria and were included in the final review.
And if the researchers take the raw, hard mathematical data from those final 22 studies and mathematically fuse them together into one giant, super-powered statistical analysis that is a meta-analysis.
Exactly. By combining the data, you massively increase the sample size and the statistical power. And researchers visualize this ultimate conclusion using something called a forest plot.
Walk us through what a forest plot actually looks like to the eye.
Imagine a graph. Running vertically right down the center is a solid line called the line of no effect. If data lands on this line, the medication did absolutely nothing.
Now, for each of the 22 individual studies included in the review, there is a horizontal line stretching across the graph with a little square sitting on it.
The position of the square represents the mathematical result of that specific study, usually calculated as an odds ratio. If the square sits far to the left of the center vertical line, it means the medication was highly effective in that study. If the square sits to the right, the medication actually harmed the patient.
And some squares are physically larger than others.
Yes, the physical size of the square visually represents the weight or sample size of that study. A massive trial with 10,000 patients gets a huge, dense square. A tiny pilot study with 50 patients gets a tiny speck of a square.
So you can visually assess the entire history of research in one glance.
But the most important part of the forest plot is at the very bottom. Below all the squares, there's a single diamond. That diamond represents the ultimate, mathematically weighted, combined result of all 22 studies and all their thousands of combined patients.
If that final diamond sits entirely to the left and its edges do not physically touch that center vertical line of no effect, you have achieved the Holy Grail. You have overwhelming, statistically significant proof across the entire body of global literature that the treatment works.
It's breathtaking. You are literally seeing the forest for the trees.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. Our researcher has constructed their paradigm. They have formulated a falsifiable theory. They have chosen their methodology. They have masterminded their sampling strategy. They have ruthlessly mapped the literature and proven their question is necessary.
Now, they must step out of the theoretical realm and interact with living, breathing human beings. Which brings us to the most critical high-stakes phase of the entire enterprise: ethics.
Because history has demonstrated over and over again in horrifying detail that when the pursuit of scientific data becomes detached from human empathy, atrocities occur.
That dark history is exactly why modern science operates within an iron cage of strict ethical guardrails. The core principles, universally recognized by bodies like the APA and detailed extensively in the Indian Council of Medical Research guidelines we are reviewing, are non-negotiable.
They revolve around fiercely protecting the physical and psychological welfare of participants, guaranteeing absolute voluntariness, maintaining total transparency, and strictly avoiding scientific misconduct like data falsification.
I want to focus intensely on the ICMR guidelines provided in our sources because they offer an incredibly nuanced, complex look at socio-behavioral research within the specific context of India.
The Indian context is a labyrinth of complexity. A researcher is operating within a society characterized by immense multi-religious, caste, class, endogamic, gender, and vast geoethnic variations. A researcher cannot simply parachute into a rural community armed with a clipboard and a rigid Western positivist mindset. They are mandated to practice ethical relativism.
Ethical relativism,
Yeah.
which means acknowledging and respecting the profound moral diversity that exists among different cultures without imposing your own framework.
Yes. The guidelines dictate that researchers must invest significant time becoming deeply conversant with the local cultural norms. They must map the invisible power dynamics to build genuine trust. And in doing so, the ICMR introduces a deeply profound ethical concept: the avoidance of harm to dignity.
I want to pause on this, because when the average person thinks of harm in a scientific study, they picture physical harm, a clinical trial for a new drug causing a severe allergic reaction, or maybe acute psychological trauma from a stressful experiment. What exactly constitutes harm to dignity?
It is a profound philosophical standard. The guidelines define harm to dignity as occurring the moment a researcher stops treating individuals as sovereign persons with their own inherent values, preferences, and agency, and instead begins treating them merely as instruments, as tools to extract data from.
Think about the last time you downloaded an app and you were presented with a 50-page terms of service document and you blindly clicked, except just to get to the game. Tech companies treat us as data extraction sites all the time. That passive, exploitative relationship is entirely normalized in the commercial world.
But in the ethical research world, it is a severe violation. If a researcher descends upon a vulnerable community, extracts the cultural stories they need for their dissertation, ignores the community's context, and leaves without offering any reciprocal value or respect, they have inflicted violence upon that community's dignity.
This high-minded philosophy translates into highly specific practical rules in the field. And there's one detail in the sources regarding ethnographic fieldwork that absolutely fascinated me: the interpreter rule.
The guidelines explicitly state that if a researcher travels to an isolated village and requires a language interpreter to conduct their interviews, the researcher should never hire a local interpreter who actually lives within that exact same village.
Which, from a pure efficiency standpoint, seems wildly counterintuitive. You would assume a local resident would possess the best grasp of the specific dialect and the local cultural nuances.
Exactly. So why is hiring them an ethical violation?
Because of the complex, invisible hierarchies and deep vulnerabilities that exist within closed communities. If you hire a local villager to act as the interpreter, The participant sitting across from you may suddenly feel deeply threatened. They might have a pre-existing familial dispute with that interpreter.
They might rightfully worry that the highly personal, sensitive answers they are giving will become local gossip tomorrow, or be weaponized against them in a future political or social conflict within the village.
The presence of the local interpreter destroys the necessary shield of anonymity.
Precisely. To eliminate that perceived threat and protect the participant, the ICMR mandates that the researcher should source an interpreter from a nearby village, someone geographically close enough to seamlessly understand the regional dialect and cultural context, but socially removed enough to provide a crucial protective buffer of safety and confidentiality for the participant.
That is an astonishing level of cultural and ethical foresight. But as I was reading through the ICMR guidelines on informed consent, I hit a section that made me stop dead in my tracks.
Informed consent is the bedrock of modern ethics. You must completely and transparently inform a person about the study before they agree to participate. But the text dedicates a section to the paradox of consent, explicitly detailing how ethics committees can legally authorize the selective withholding of study information from participants.
Let me aggressively push back on this. Doesn't the intentional withholding of information completely obliterate the word informed consent? How can a researcher ethically lie, or lie by omission to a human subject?
It is the most perilous ethical tightrope in the behavioral sciences. But to understand why the exception exists, you have to understand the psychological phenomenon known as the Hawthorne effect.
Imagine you are designing a psychological study to test implicit, unconscious racial biases in hiring managers, or a study measuring how quickly people will conform to peer pressure to give a wrong answer. If you sit the participant down and explicitly tell them, "Hello, today I'm going to measure your hidden racism and your susceptibility to peer pressure," what is going to happen?
The experiment instantly self-destructs. The moment I know you're watching me for bias, my conscious brain takes over, my behavior drastically alters, and I will perform the role of the perfect, unbiased, independent thinker. The data becomes entirely invalid.
Exactly. The human subjects act differently precisely because they know what is being observed. Therefore, the ICMR and the APA allow ethics committees to permit the temporary selective withholding of the exact hypothesis only if two incredibly strict conditions are met.
First, the researcher must prove that withholding the information is absolutely necessary to achieve an overarching social or public good. The knowledge gained must be highly valuable to society. Second, and most importantly, withholding the information cannot in any way increase the risk of physical or emotional harm to the participant.
So to be crystal clear, a medical researcher can never, under any circumstances, withhold the fact that an experimental pill might cause a heart attack.
Absolutely never. You can never withhold risks. You are only permitted to withhold the precise psychological mechanism being observed.
And crucially, this permission comes with a massive, non-negotiable caveat: the debriefing.
The moment the data collection is finished, the researcher must immediately sit down with the participant, pull back the curtain, reveal the true nature of the study, and explain exactly why the deception was necessary.
And at that moment, if the participant feels violated or upset by the deception, they possess the absolute right to demand that their data be deleted and withdrawn from the study. It is a highly regulated, tightly controlled exception designed to save behavioral science from the Hawthorne effect.
Okay. The research has been conducted, the data is secure, the ethical guardrails held strong, the participants were debriefed, the study is over.
Now we arrive at the final frontier: structuring and sharing the science. The researcher is sitting on a mountain of data, but raw data is useless. They must translate years of labor into a highly structured, rigid language that the global scientific community can instantly understand, critique, and attempt to replicate.
And that universal language of original scientific research is formatted according to the IMRAD structure, IMRAD.
Let's break down the anatomy of a scientific paper.
I stands for Introduction. This is where the researcher builds the stage. They clearly state the specific problem, they synthesize the history of the literature review we discussed earlier, they identify the critical gap in human knowledge, and they plant their flag by stating their exact hypothesis.
As for methods,
The recipe. How exactly did you conduct this study? What was the paradigm? Was it a phenomenological qualitative design or a randomized quantitative trial? How did you execute your stratified sampling? What exact survey instruments did you use? This section must be written with such exhaustive, granular detail that a rival researcher sitting in a laboratory on the other side of the planet could read it and replicate your study perfectly.
R is for results.
This is the cold, unfeeling heart of the paper. What did you actually find? This section is devoid of emotion and interpretation. It is pure data output. Statistical tables, calculated p-values, transcribed quotes from ethnographic interviews, and forest plots. Just the facts.
A is just the conjunction, and which ties us to the final letter, D for discussion.
The discussion is where the researcher regains their voice. What does this mountain of data actually mean? They interpret the cold results, reconnect them to the original theory like Bowlby's attachment framework, and vigorously debate the real-world, applied implications of their findings.
But within that discussion section, there is a specific subsection mandated by APA guidelines that I find to be one of the most endearing and vital parts of the entire scientific enterprise, the limitations section.
Yes. The limitations section is where the researcher is professionally obligated to tell on themselves.
They have to publicly expose their own weaknesses. They have to write, "Our cluster sampling method failed to capture urban demographics," or "We relied heavily on convenience sampling for the pilot, so these results cannot be generalized," or "Our interview protocol might have introduced interviewer bias."
It is a mandatory display of profound scientific humility. Admitting your flaws in print doesn't destroy your credibility, it actually fortifies it. It proves you possess the objectivity to critique your own labor.
And practically, it acts as a massive glowing neon sign for the next generation of graduate students, essentially screaming, "Hey, the concept is sound, but my method was flawed. Do this exact study again next year, but fix my mistake."
It is the magnificent engine of cumulative science. Science is not a single genius having a flawless thought. It is thousands of researchers slowly fixing each other's mistakes over decades.
Finally, you reach the end of the paper, which means we must confront the absolute bane of every tired graduate student's existence: referencing styles, the citations, the bibliographies.
Our sources spend considerable time detailing the differences between the major styles: APA, AMA, and Vancouver.
They are the strict grammatical laws of attribution. APA, developed by the American Psychological Association, is the dominant force in psychology and the broader social sciences. Its defining characteristic is the author-date system within the text itself. When you read an APA paper, the citation looks like this. In parentheses, it would just say the author's last name, Smith, and the year 2020.
Then you cross the campus to the medical school, and they are using AMA, the American Medical Association style. AMA values visual cleanliness and extreme brevity. Instead of disrupting the sentence with names and dates, it uses tiny superscript numbers floating above the words. And the reference list at the back of the paper isn't alphabetized, it is strictly numbered in the chronological order the papers were mentioned.
And closely related is the Vancouver style, heavily utilized in global biomedical sciences. It also relies on a numbered system, but typically encloses the numbers in square brackets within the text, like a bracketed one.
Okay, I have to ask the question every student asks at 2 a.m. while fixing citations. Is there genuinely a profound philosophical reason for these wildly different formatting styles? Or is this just bureaucratic academic nitpicking designed to give professors an excuse to deduct points because I used a comma instead of a period? It feels entirely arbitrary.
It feels maddeningly arbitrary when you're typing it out, but it actually perfectly reflects the underlying values and functional needs of the different disciplines.
Think about the context. In psychology, sociology, and the social sciences which use APA, the historical timeline of the theory and the identity of the theorist are critically fundamentally important. Knowing that a specific idea about human attachment was proposed by Bowlby in 1969 versus a brand new researcher in 2024 completely changes how you interpret the weight and context of that sentence. Therefore, the author and the date are forced right into the middle of the text, front and center.
Oh.
But step into the high-stakes world of clinical medicine using AMA or Vancouver. A trauma surgeon reading a paper on a new blood clotting protocol does not care about the historical narrative of the idea. They do not care who wrote the paper or if it was published in October versus December. They only care that it is the most current, empirically validated science available.
What they desperately need is to absorb incredibly dense, complex clinical information as rapidly and cleanly as possible. Stumbling over long parenthetical lists of 4 different authors and dates in the middle of a sentence about surgical techniques slows down the reading process. So, clinical medicine uses tiny, unobtrusive superscript numbers to save physical space and maintain the rapid flow of the text. The seemingly arbitrary formatting is actually serving the life or death function of the field. Okay, I will begrudgingly concede that that is actually brilliant. Form follows function, even down to the placement of a citation comma. Wow. Let's take a final breath and look back at the sheer scale of the architecture we have just traversed. We started deep underground, debating the ontology of what reality even is. We climbed the epistemological trunk of how we acquire knowledge. We ventured out onto the massive methodological branches, exploring the cold mathematics of quantitative research and the deep human intimacy of qualitative phenomenology, ethnography, and grounded theory. We saw how John Bowlby's theory organized the chaos of Princess Diana's life. We navigated the statistical nightmares of sampling. We survived the CR tape test. We confronted the heavy ethical burdens of protecting human dignity and the paradox of consent, and we drilled all the way down to the functional utility of a superscript number in a medical journal.
It is a massive, awe-inspiring, and deeply interdependent architecture. Every single component connects. The philosophical paradigm dictates the theory dictates the qualitative or quantitative the method dictates the sampling strategy, the sample is guarded by the ethical compass, and the entire endeavor is communicated through the rigid structure of the final paper. It is a complete, interlocking, self-correcting system.
So what does this massive deep dive mean for you, the person listening to this? Why did we drag you through the intricacies of critical realism and snowball sampling?
Because you do not live in a vacuum. You live in an ecosystem that constantly bombards you with information claiming to be the absolute truth.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
The next time you open your phone and a viral headline aggressively screams at you, "New study proves X," I want you to pause. I want you to take that headline and run it through the blueprint you just mastered today.
Ask yourself, what was the researchers' underlying paradigm? Were they searching for a universal positivist law, or were they mapping a constructed qualitative meaning? Did they utilize a theory that was actually falsifiable, or was it pseudoscience designed to accommodate every outcome? How did they gather their sample? Did they rigorously stratify a massive population, or did they just lazily convenient sample 20 college freshmen sitting in a break room?
You are no longer relegated to being a passive, anxious consumer of the daily news feed. You now possess the architectural blueprints of knowledge generation. You have the analytical tools to rigorously interrogate the science that is presented to you.
Remember the analogy from the beginning. When you look at an X-ray of a broken arm, the reality is clean, binary, and comforting. But the reality of human behavior, of our societies, our trauma, and our health is rarely that clean. It is wonderfully, terrifyingly complex.
Science isn't about perfectly capturing reality in a single, flawless snapshot. Science is the painstaking, ethical, and relentless process of building a bridge of understanding over the chaos. And now you know exactly how to check the engineering of that bridge to see if it can actually hold the weight of the truth.